On July 5, 1943, as the first panzer tanks began their advance toward the Soviet defenses, the sky above Kursk ceased to be empty space. It became a direct extension of the battlefield. Up there, a separate war was being fought, where pilots flew in dogfights with hundreds of aircraft. The air battle of Kursk was distinguished by a series of very defined tactical features, repeated day after day, which gave it a completely different character from previous campaigns. On the morning of July 5, 1943, at 2:30 a.m., German aircraft began taking off from forward airfields in Belgorod, Tomarovka and Kharkov, followed shortly afterward by the first Soviet formations climbing from scattered fields near Oboyan, Kursk and Ponyri. Within minutes, hundreds of aircraft were en route to relatively narrow sectors of the front, creating a continuous flow that forced commanders to organize staggered sorties to avoid collisions and navigational confusion. The German aircraft were part of the 8th Fliegerkorps under the command of the experienced Hans Seidemann, who had concentrated a substantial part of the available force to support the attack of Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army. Units like Jagdgeschwader 52, equipped with the Messerschmitt Bf 109G, an agile fighter with a closed cockpit and a powerful Daimler-Benz engine optimized for rapid climb and close-range combat, were involved. Jagdgeschwader 3 and Jagdgeschwader 54, on the other hand, had some Focke-Wulf Fw 190As, more robust with wide wings and heavy armament, effective at low altitudes. These were joined by specialized ground support wings like Sturzkampfgeschwader 2 and 77 with the slow but accurate Ju-87D Stukas with fixed landing gear. It was also the ideal time for squadrons equipped with the new Henschel H's 129 compact armored twin-engine aircraft heavily armed with 75 mm cannons for anti-tank missions. In the southern sector alone, more than 1,000 operational aircraft could be assembled, including fighters, dive bombers and attack aircraft. Facing them were Stepan Krasovsky's Soviet Second Air Army and Sergei Rudenko's 16th Air Army, which deployed an even larger force. Their fighter divisions operated Yak-1S and Yak-7SS, light, maneuverable and of wooden construction, alongside the reliable, faster and more rugged Lavochkin La-5, with a radial engine capable of performing well at low altitudes. The assault regiments fielded the Ilyushin Il-2 Shturmovik, a robust aircraft armored like a ground vehicle, designed to penetrate enemy fire while launching RS-82 rockets and cannon fire against mechanized columns. In total, the Soviets concentrated several thousand aircraft in the area of operation, distributed across multiple airfields to sustain a constant flow of missions. Kursk concentrated between 2,400 and 2,700 Russian aircraft, distributed across numerous airfields positioned behind the front lines. Facing them, the Luftwaffe managed to assemble approximately 1,800 aircraft in direct support of Operation Citadel, a very high concentration by German standards in 1943, but smaller in absolute numbers than the Soviet force. It was the largest concentration of aircraft since the Battle of Britain. From the command posts of Jagdgeschwader 52, the first messages arrived in the bunkers dug alongside the runway. Pilots reported multiple contacts on a single flight, while Soviet squadrons took off at intervals of minutes to replace those returning with low fuel. Soon the sky above Kursk became an intricate mountain of white lines, the contrails of the engines pointing in all directions and intersecting in deadly duels. On the morning of July 5th, over the Yakovlevo and Cherkaskoye area, groups of Stuka dive bombers simultaneously attacked as Il-2S advanced toward the German lines. From elevated positions, Bf 109S engaged the Yaks, attempting to intercept them, creating multiple fragmented engagements within the same geographical sector. This build-up forced both sides to operate in very short cycles. The nearby airfields allowed a single pilot to make several sorties a day, rearming and taking off again in less than an hour. The air battle thus acquired a continuous character without defined moments of beginning or end, with units entering combat as soon as they reached their assigned area. As the critical day of July 5, 1943, progressed, the battle began to compress downwards, forcing pilots to operate ever closer to the ground. Formations that had taken off to provide high cover were rapidly descending upon receiving reports of moving columns, artillery concentrations, or armored penetrations detected by forward observers. In the Belgorod sector, groups of Jagdgeschwader 52 under Oberstleutnant Dietrich Hrabak, with officers such as Gerhard Barkhorn, operated by launching patrols that within minutes transitioned from surveillance to direct engagement on the battlefield. At the same time, elements of Jagdgeschwader 3 commanded by Kurt Brandl and Walter Dahl were operating from forward bases, covering attacks against Soviet lines, while other units of Luftflotte 4 carried out tactical bombing raids on identified positions around Gramuchi and Gostischewo. The use of He-111 and Ju-88 bombers linked to the infantry's field radios. These requested direct support missions and took off under fighter protection in a very confined space. For the first time, an air campaign was being fought at very low altitude. This was due to the immediate need to identify specific targets. Soviet columns camouflaged among trees or stalled on muddy roads were difficult to locate from high altitude, so attacks were carried out using visual approaches. Norbert Hanning, an ace who would end the war piloting an Me-262, witnessed a group of soldiers evacuating a wounded officer while calling for help. The low-altitude flight allowed him to see the arrival of Stukas that cleared the area for the trapped platoon. That wounded officer turned out to be his own brother. Upon arriving at the base, the German crews were thirsty and exhausted, but they described to those who were to succeed them in the attacks what it was like to walk through a layer of smoke or dust raised by the artillery. The Soviet reaction was equally direct. Fighter regiments operating Yak and Lavochkin aircraft were sent to intercept over the same areas where the ground combat was taking place, guided by intelligence arriving almost in real time from frontline commands. In the air, engagements no longer took place at high altitudes but occurred during the attack phases themselves. A group initiating a dive or a strafing run could encounter enemy fighters that had just descended to engage the same area. This proximity transformed combat into a series of rapid actions with little time to regroup, where pilots had to decide in seconds whether to continue the attack or break off to defend themselves. By nightfall on July 5th, the intensity of the fighting forced the Soviets to adopt a system of continuous pressure aimed at overwhelming the German capacity to react. That day, while the ground offensive was officially underway, the Luftwaffe flew at least 2,387 sorties in the southern sector, compared to 1,688 by the two Soviet air forces, figures that illustrate the immediate scale of the confrontation. The Soviet response did not consist of concentrating everything into a single strike, but rather of maintaining successive attacks throughout the day, so that when a German formation finished one engagement, it would almost immediately face another entering the area. Jagdgeschwader 52 and Jagdgeschwader 3 were thus forced to take off repeatedly from the same airfields to intercept contacts detected time and again in the same sectors of the front. The most experienced German pilots, including figures like Günther Rahl and Gerhard Barkhorn, fought at an operational pace that demanded up to 5 missions a day, taking advantage of their vast experience accumulated on the Eastern Front. These airmen would go on to score hundreds of victories throughout the war. The brunt of the fighting fell particularly on these veteran groups, such as those of Jagdgeschwader 52. In July 1943, pilots like Berthold Kortz, already with numerous previous victories, commanded squadrons that saw action repeatedly during the operation, several of them achieving ace-in-a-day feats, 5 or more kills in just a few hours. Heinrich Sturm, another ace from the same Geschwader, achieved 158 victories on the Eastern Front and also recorded several days of multiple kills, reflecting the repetitive close-quarters combat that characterized the campaign. The result was a dynamic of continuous attrition. On certain days, the Germans claimed to have achieved hundreds of kills in a single day of air combat, demonstrating the scale of the engagements that occurred almost without interruption. Within the Soviet assault aviation units, the Shturmoviki, one of the most representative figures associated with the fighting of the summer of 1943, was Anna Yegorovna Timofeyeva Yegorova of the 805th Assault Aviation Regiment. The Shturmovik regiments operated very differently from fighter regiments. They flew in tight groups at low altitude, following routes marked by ground observers to attack columns, anti-tank batteries, and armored assembly areas. The pilot's objective was not aerial victories, but rather to withstand defensive fire long enough to deliver rockets and cannon fire to very specific targets. These sorties could be repeated several times a day, with minimal intervals for rearming and checking for damage to the armored fuselage. During the period that began at Kursk, Yegorova accumulated dozens of direct attack missions, participating in operations against German troop concentrations and motorized transport along the axes of advance toward Oboyan and Belgorod. These missions were extremely dangerous. The Il-2 entered the firing range of light anti-aircraft guns, machine guns, and often German fighters that descended to intercept them while they were still in the attack phase. Survival depended on maintaining close formation and taking advantage of the group's mutual protection. Another important name in the assault arm was Nikolai Platonovich Kamenin, a veteran with extensive experience and one of the commanders who consolidated the doctrine of mass employment of the Il-2. Although his later fame was linked to the Soviet space program, during the war he led assault units that established the methods used at Kursk: repeated attacks, guided from the ground, against immediate tactical targets to slow enemy movement. Vasily Borisovich Emelianenko, an Il-2 pilot with hundreds of combat sorties who participated in operations on the Voronezh front during that period, also stood out. His memoirs describe attacks against German columns stalled in minefields or logistical bottlenecks, typical situations at Kursk where the Shturmovik acted almost like a flying artillery battery. What was distinctive about these Il-2 aces was that their prestige was not measured by kills, as in the German Jagdgeschwader, but by the number of missions flown under direct fire, accuracy in their attacks, and their ability to return with a damaged aircraft. Within this scenario of repeated attacks and constant escorts, the figure of a young pilot from Jagdgeschwader 52 stood out, a man who was not yet the legendary name he would later become. Erich Hartmann, then Oberleutnant and still considered by many comrades as Booby because of his age, had begun the 1943 campaign as a wing escort for Alfred Gryzlowski and Edmund Rossmann, absorbing from them a combat method based on approaching the enemy at very short distances before opening fire. His rise coincided precisely with the summer fighting. On July 5, 1943, the opening day of the offensive, he achieved 4 aerial victories, and 2 days later he shot down 4 Le-5S and 3 Il-2S in a single series of missions, results that marked the beginning of a very rapid progression within the battle. During that month, he accumulated 23 victories, including 7 in a single day, a sign of the intensity of the fighting around the salient. One morning in July, for example, his swarm received orders to escort an FW-189 observation plane. The 4 fighters took off a few minutes after starting their engines and ascended directly to the combat zone, following procedures already mechanized by the frequency of sorties. The clearest counterpoint between the German and Soviet aces in the skies of Kursk was embodied in the figure of Lieutenant Alexander Konstantinovich Gorovets, a pilot who fought in very different conditions than Erich Hartmann, and whose most famous action occurred in the midst of the German offensive. Gorovets flew with the 40th Guards Fighter Regiment, a unit very active in the Oboyan sector during the early stages of the fighting, where its pilots shot down dozens of German aircraft between early June and mid-July 1943 in direct support of Soviet defenses. Unlike the free-ranging hunting practiced by many German pilots, their activity was subordinated to ground troop cover, bomber interception, and breaking up enemy formations attempting to strike Soviet positions. The episode that made him an iconic figure occurred on the second day of the battle. That day he took off in a Lavochkin Le-5FN, designed specifically for close-quarters combat over the front lines. Upon encountering a large formation of escorted German bombers, he launched a solo attack against a group that vastly outnumbered him. In that single engagement, he managed to shoot down 9 enemy aircraft during the same sortie, an exceptional figure even within the standards of the Eastern Front, setting the record for the most victories achieved in a single mission during the battle. This type of combat differed profoundly from Hartmann's style. While the German pilots sought stealth, single-shot attacks, and immediate break of contact, Gorovets operated within a saturated airspace, facing multiple simultaneous adversaries and under constant pressure from anti-aircraft defenses and other escorts. His attacks involved remaining in combat longer, repeatedly maneuvering, and accepting a much greater risk to prevent bombers from reaching their tactical targets. The operational environment also marked a doctrinal difference. The Soviet Air Force at Kursk was integrated into a defense-in-depth system that combined advanced intelligence on German attack lines, massive artillery concentrations, and coordinated attacks by ground attack aircraft like the Il-2 Shturmovik, designed to strike German forces even on their airfields. In this scheme, fighters acted as immediate protection for the ground forces, reacting to specific threats rather than engaging in prolonged attrition patrols. Thus, while Hartmann represented the German logic of individual supremacy and selective hunting, Gorovets embodied the Soviet model of direct intervention in the land battle, with short, violent fights very close to the front. The battle raged on, and missions continued in the southern sector of the salient. There, the 2nd SS Panzer Corps advanced toward Oboyan and Prokhorovka between July 5 and 9, 1943. German close air support concentrated on direct attack missions against anti-tank artillery, tank concentrations, and Soviet reserve columns, attempting to close the gaps opened by the panzers. The dive bomber units Sturzkampfgeschwader II and Sturzkampfgeschwader 77 flew the majority of sorties assigned to the 88th Flieger Corps, executing approximately 701 missions in immediate support of ground forces on July 8 alone. In the first days of the offensive, the volume of operations was very high, with more than 1,000 Stuka sorties recorded on July 5th, a figure that gradually decreased to 700-800 in subsequent days, and approximately half after July 10th, due to the increase in Soviet air resistance and the losses suffered. The tactical employment of the Ju-87S focused on highly localized attacks, coordinated by forward liaisons with the Panzer divisions and the Waffen-SS. The aircraft descended at steep angles against gun batteries, fortified infantry positions, and tank concentrations detected by reconnaissance, seeking to cripple the defense just before the ground advance. During the initial fighting, these units suffered significant losses. For example, 6 Stukas shot down on July 5th alone, reflecting the increasing density of Soviet anti-aircraft defenses around the salient. Effectiveness depended on the accuracy of direct hits, since destroying tanks with bombs required very close or direct strikes on the target, a characteristic that limited the tactic to repeated low-altitude attacks. Within that same deployment emerged the specific use of the modified Ju-87 for anti-tank warfare, an adaptation born from the urgent need to halt Soviet armored concentrations detected before the start of the offensive. These versions, later identified as the Ju-87G, eliminated traditional bombs and mounted 237 BK cannons under the wings with magazines for hardcore armor-piercing ammunition. The aircraft, already known for its angular silhouette and streamlined fixed landing gear, took on a completely different role. Instead of the classic vertical dive against specific targets, it flew at low altitude searching for moving armored columns. Hans Ulrich Rudel was the driving force behind the systematic use of this variant and developed a technically precise attack profile. Missions began with a very low approach, typically between 10 and 20 meters above ground level, using contours of the land, tree lines, or smoke plumes to mask the approach and reduce the reaction time of the air defenses. Once the target was identified, the pilot made a short climb to about 250-300 meters to gain a firing angle, and from there initiated a controlled descent of approximately 10 degrees to 20 degrees, much flatter than the classic Stuka dive. This geometry allowed the target to remain in the sights for longer and compensate for the significant ballistic drop of the 37 mm projectiles. The firing was generally carried out between 300 and 400 meters, a distance considered optimal for ensuring penetration without excessive exposure to defensive fire. Rudel aimed to attack from the rear of the tank, aligning himself with the target's longitudinal axis to hit the engine cowling or the turret crown, where the T-34's armor thinned considerably compared to the sloping frontal glacis. After opening fire with 1 or 2 brief bursts, he had fired a total of 14 rounds. The pilot immediately applied full power and executed a violent roll and evasive turn at low altitude, descending again below 50 meters to escape the fire of heavy machine guns and automatic cannons. Rudel described days when he repeatedly attacked the same area of the battlefield, refueling and resupplying to take off again within minutes, a continuous cycle that transformed the Ju-87 into a kind of flying artillery. In one of these initial actions, he claimed to have destroyed a dozen tanks in a single day, a result that caught the attention of the German command because it demonstrated that, when used with precision and surprise, the Stuka could neutralize heavy armor without resorting to ground artillery. Alongside the Stuka tank destroyers, the Henschel H's 129 operated. Designed from the ground up as an anti-tank attack aircraft, it featured a heavily protected cockpit and heavy armament mounted in ventral pods, including 30 mm and 37 mm cannons specifically developed for close-range armor penetration. These weapons could employ hardcore ammunition capable of penetrating significant thicknesses of steel at very short ranges, forcing pilots to make extremely low and straight attacks, exposing themselves to anti-aircraft fire and machine gun fire from the tanks themselves. The H's 129 typically operated in small formations, searching for armored columns detected by forward observers and attacking them repeatedly to disrupt their advance before they reached the German front lines. In the final stages of these battles, Soviet pressure directly threatened several forward airfields from which close air support units were operating. This situation was recalled years later by Paul Werner Hotzel, then a Stuka commander, and later a Luftwaffe brigadier general, who described how the airfight momentarily devolved into a desperate defense of the airfield itself. As he recounted in a 1978 lecture, despite the German army's most intense efforts in delaying tactics, a Soviet armored force managed to reach the vicinity of Dugino and threatened the airbase. From that moment on, sorties were flown independently, with the sole objective of keeping the airfield operational. The missions were extremely brief, generally no more than 15 minutes. Take off, attack, land, rearm, and take off again immediately. Some Soviet tanks advanced almost to the perimeter of the airfield, only to be repelled by anti-tank guns and heavy anti-aircraft fire. Thanks to the immediate cooperation between available Army and Luftwaffe forces, the attack was contained and Dugino remained in German hands. The overall effect of this air attack was tactical and immediate rather than cumulative, intervening at critical points on the front, supporting specific advances, and attacking armored concentrations at decisive moments. However, the progressive reduction in the number of sorties after the first few days, caused by losses and growing Soviet resistance, limited its impact in the culminating phase of the fighting around Prokhorovka, where the volume of missions dropped significantly compared to the start of the operation. The air battle over Kursk was notable less for a single decisive engagement than for the continuous, almost industrial intensity of air power deployed in direct support of the ground battle. From July 5, 1943, the opening day of the German offensive, activity reached extraordinary levels. More than 2,000 sorties were flown in a single day in support of the 4th Panzer Army alone, accompanying the advance of some 700 tanks and assault guns attempting to break through the Soviet defenses. Overall, both sides concentrated an air force in the Kursk salient comparable to that employed in major strategic campaigns. The Axis forces amassed around 1,800 aircraft compared to approximately 2,100 Soviet aircraft, integrated into a much larger deployment of troops, artillery and reserves that sustained the battle in depth. This Soviet numerical superiority on the ground was also reflected in the way they organized their air force. They dispersed aircraft across numerous airfields protected by anti-aircraft rings to reduce vulnerability to German attacks and ensure operational continuity. Despite having fewer strategic resources than in previous years, the Luftwaffe maintained an extremely high level of activity. Throughout the battle, it flew tens of thousands of missions, some 37,000 sorties in total, dropping around 20,000 tons of bombs and claiming the destruction of more than 1,700 enemy aircraft with relatively low losses of its own. This demonstrates that, on an immediate tactical level, the German Air Force still retained considerable shock capability, able to rapidly concentrate its forces on the sectors where the Panzer Corps were advancing. However, the dynamics of air combat were already changing. Soviet aviation was steadily increasing its operational rate thanks to the continuous replacement of aircraft and crews, while German capabilities were spread across several simultaneous fronts. The result was increasing pressure that prevented the Luftwaffe from achieving prolonged air superiority, even when it gained temporary air superiority in specific sectors. Another distinctive feature was the deeply tactical nature of the missions. The German emphasis remained on interdiction and close air support for mobile forces, attacking transports, trains, logistical positions, and enemy concentrations to facilitate ground maneuvers, a pattern typical of German air-ground doctrine since the beginning of the war. At Kursk, this role was repeated almost mechanically. The Air Force operated as a direct extension of the armored units, attempting to breach the lines, disrupt Soviet reserves, and maintain the offensive momentum. The skies over Kursk marked the beginning of a transition, from the air war of opportunity and localized superiority that had favored Germany between 1941 and 1942, towards a model of sustained combat where the amount of resources, the rotation of units, and industrial capacity would progressively determine who could continue flying, attacking, and replacing losses over time.